Hi guys, welcome back to Didsbury Art Studio. I'm Sally if you haven't met me before, and in today's video we're going to be doing hand embroidery. So let's make a start. So last week I did a video on Sharpie dyeing, making a scar. Two practice pieces here. I decided to do free motion embroidery on it, and this one I decided to do hand stitch. So this video is all about the different hand stitches that I used on this practice piece. So I'm going to start by cutting this white spongy fabric, which is called wadding. I'm going to cut it the same size as my silk piece. This fabric is going to provide me with a quilted effect once I start sewing with the hand stitch, but also the machine stitch. And here I am just threading my needle, so I've got about an arm's length of thread, and I'm just wrapping the other end of the thread, the other end of where the opposite end to the needle, and you just wrap it around the needle and make a knot. Then you come from behind the fabrics, both fabrics, and start your stitching. Now this stitching is called a tacking stitch, and its job is to hold two bits of fabrics together and provide some sort of stability when you start sewing over the top with your decoration stitches. So I'm going to be zigzagging across both fabrics, and each stitch is going to be about between 1 and 2 centimetres long. As I said, this is a temporary stitch, tacking stitch, which is just there whilst we're doing the overall decorative stitches, and then we cut these tacking stitches out later. So in other words, it's kind of functional. It's not as if it has to be very neat, but I am following a bit of a pattern here, which, as I said, I'm zigzagging and traversing across the fabrics to hold it all together. I'm also going to hand stitch down the sides of the fabric and across the width as well in several parts. So this is what it looks like at the moment, just before I put on a couple more stitches at the sides. Now moving on, I'm deciding here on which coloured threads I want to put on top of this little green section. So I'm trying to pick a bright sort of yellow colour that is going to look good with this little section here. So you can see I did run a stitch over the top, and I drew out a pattern over the top of it, a different one to what I'd painted. And then on the next bit I was choosing some thread there, and I've gone with a dark red, so it goes over the top of the paler red there. And again, I'm doing a very different pattern over the top of the pattern that I've painted there, just to make sure that it stands out. And this is going to provide me with a quilted technique. Now, quilting is when you stitch over the top of the wadding and any other fabric, and it provides a kind of cushioned effect. It's sort of padded effect, and it stands out. So wherever you put the stitching, that will be held down and the rest of it kind of protrudes outwards. Gives a really nice effect. So I'm just finishing off my little pattern there, and we're going to move on to the next bit. And then I'm just tying a knot at the back of the work. Try and get your knot as close to the back of your fabric as you can, and then it won't come apart. So here I'm using the running stitch again with the pink, light pink thread. You can vary the length of the running stitch and use this for decoration too. Here I'm going around the pinky purple pattern there, and around the red and orange square you can see there. And sometimes I slant the stitches to give a different type of effect. Sometimes I use different stitch lengths. Sometimes I go around the pattern, and sometimes I do a completely different pattern over the top of the pieces. Now, as I said, this is one of the 2 practice pieces that I did for last week's project when I did the Sharpies, the Sharpie dyeing on a scarf. So I came up with some patterns off the internet and put these on some spare fabric that I had. So this stitch here, I'm using French knots. So you twist the you twist the thread around the needle and then take it back down through the fabric and you'll get a kind of knot. So you can do little clusters of the French knots, or you can space them out. You can use a completely different colour so that they stand out on the background colour. And I did 2 different colours, I think, on that one, with the blue background. Love French knots. They have a really good effect on your piece of work. Just gives loads of different textures and decoration, and you can fill in shapes quite well with them as well. So usually with French knots, I sort of twist the thread around 3 or 4 times around the needle. Try to use quite a thin needle, and I'm using embroidery thread there, so it's quite thick. And if it does get stuck, the needle, when you're pulling it through the fabric, just give it a little bit of a wriggle and help. Just manipulate the fabric a little bit to allow the needle to come through. As you can see there, I'm really giving it a bit of a tug to get it through, but I do normally get it through the fabric. Yeah, I've got it through. There you go. And there's one of the bonuses of hand stitching. You can sit outside and it's mobile and you can go in any room of the house to do it, so it's great. So here I am into doing some dark green on that pale green fabric, and I am filling in some of the shapes there with parallel horizontal stitches, all the same size. So you can see here when I'm sewing densely with some of my stitches, I'm sewing through the 2 layers of the fabric and it creates a sort of padded effect around it, and that's what the quilting is. So as you can see here, I haven't necessarily drawn my design on. That's because I often just look at a design or pattern and sort of adapt it and evolve it as I go along. However, most of the time I obviously plan it out and draw onto the fabric, and I advise that you do that. But if you're feeling confident and you want to launch straight in, then go for it. That's completely up to you if you feel confident to do that. You can see with this stitch here that I've kept in one pivotal point, but done the runner stitch, but done long and short lengths and mixed it up a little bit. So basically made the stitch up to fit the pattern that I wanted to do. So you can see that the runner stitch that I've been using a lot of does provide a function, but also you can use it as a decorative stitch. And I'm using quite thick thread here, but you can separate the strands of the embroidery thread out so you can get different thicknesses. But I quite like the thicker stuff because obviously it stands out better. You can also sew with wool if you wanted as well, as long as you've got a needle that's got a big enough eye to get the wool through. So I'm using 2 different shades of yellow for this stitch here. I'm just covering quite a full area there of a yellowy greeny background actually, yeah. And I'm brightening it up here with this quite strong red. So quite often, as I said, the stitches evolve as I'm working. So some areas are very different to a more uniform kind of stitch, so I'll have different lengths of stitches and different directions of stitches. Yeah. This pale pink stitch, I'm doing 3 runner stitches side by side, 3 stitches at a time in the same direction. And here I'm just doing a freestyle kind of cross stitch. And yeah, just having a go really at experimenting, which I do encourage. Hand embroidery is just such an amazing way of working. You can just feel really quiet and calm, and I think it's really therapeutic. And it's just such a pleasure to do, and it's something that I've found really satisfying doing during the lockdown period and previous to that as well. So hopefully you will enjoy it too. This final stitch is where you take the thread and loop it underneath your needle and it becomes a chain, and it's called a chain stitch, and you can do outlines with it. So when you finish your piece, you need to go back in with your scissors and cut the tacking stitch out so it's not left in your piece. I find with hand stitching that there's a great deal of flexibility with it, and it's also mobile. It's easy to have a few different thread colours on the go as well, different thread textures to give it different effects. It's great for absolute beginners, and you can decide on the different lengths of stitches and where exactly you want them to go. So there's a great deal of choice, I guess, with the hand stitching. And the decorative stitches, like they're all decorative stitches, but the chain stitch there, you can't actually do necessarily on the machines, so I quite like it. Now the cons of the hand stitching are it is a slow process and the stitches are generally quite inconsistent. So I hope you liked this video, and for more videos like this one, please subscribe to my channel.